Hello, class. Welcome to week 2 in group counseling. This is video number 2, and today we're going to be talking about kind of the stages of group development, different types of groups, kind of what that looks like. But before I get into that, let me just give you some announcements. I know I made them on the blackboard. As far as APA, make sure you're formatting their citations. A couple students asked, well, isn't discussion board just my opinion? And it is your point of view, but it's always good practice to show where you're getting your point of view. So if you're saying, you believe in group makes an impact, then a good source to talk about that would be the Corey textbook, because Corey gives various sources as to how groups make a positive impact for individuals. So that's just one example. I also gave another example in the syllabus. If you're talking about multilingual individuals, and you want to you want to show research, then I would look at sources such as Arredondo, Sanchez, different sources, different professors that have looked into what you're referring to. If I just say, groups are good, that's great. I'm glad I believe that, but what am I backing my statement with? So make sure you're doing that. As far as the group experience, like I mentioned, 5-hour minimum requirement. I know some people are having trouble. Please, in your journals, let me know what steps you're taking. This is a 7-week course. It's possible that you won't have a group every week, but I do hope that you go beyond the 5-hour minimum expectation. And also, if you're having trouble with APA formatting, please use the Writing Center as a resource. I know Ms. Holman, our academic coach, has been great at answering everybody's questions, so I certainly appreciate her and kind of what she's been doing. Okay, so now moving on, let's get into the meat of the discussion this week. The stages of group development, and these are important because, kind of like individual counseling, there should be a flow. There should be a clear beginning, middle, and end. It shouldn't just be, you're coming into therapy. We're just going to discuss random things. We're going to free associate. That's not kind of realistic in my point of view. There should be a stated goal. There should be objectives. There should be almost like a plan. I call it a skeleton. Some people call it an outline of how how a facilitator is going to meet the goal that is stated at the beginning. Okay, so to me, a group, for example, when I do my groups at the schools, whenever I give the informed consent to the parents, I explain what a group is, I explain the purpose of a group, how the child will refer to me, how I think they may benefit, some of the risk, and I also give them an outline along with the informed consent. So I'm not only explaining what it's going to look like, but I'm also going to give them the main bullets that we're going to highlight. And the purpose is twofold. One, I want to keep them informed. I never want a parent calling me saying, why is my child participating in a group? That should never happen. part of the ASCA, which is the American Association for School Counselors, along with the LPC board, states that clients must be informed of any participation in any group individual setting. So that's why we have the informed consent paperwork. I know I mentioned if the job site or wherever you're going to, a lot of times they have their own paperwork, and that's fine, just as long as we have documentation of it. But anyhow, getting back to how I run it is, I want to inform the parent of what I'm doing, my purpose, my objective, and the other one is I want them to talk to their child about what I'm talking to them. Many times I want parents as allies, because if we're both talking, let's say, about anger management, if we're both talking to them, it kind of reiterates and it kind of makes them really part of the education process, which is one of as a facilitator, it's one of my goals, because I can talk to them all I want, but part of their learning is their home environment. So really, having parents as allies, and I think, in my experience, that has worked great. That's kind of what I suggest schools counselors do. It kind of coincides with the ASCA model of school counseling, as well as the community model, because when we talk about family and family dynamics, there's various parts to that. So the more parts that we can bring in, the better, or the more impact we can have. Okay, so getting to the highlights of the different groups. So there is closed groups and there's open groups. And this is important because many times that changes the dynamics, of the groups. And as a facilitator, you have to decide what type of group you're going to have. So an open group refers to a group where somebody can walk in at any time. So let's say you're having a 8-session, let's say self-esteem group, and you have different outline, you have kind of the skeleton, you talk about each theme, who am I, how do I perceive myself, how do other people perceive myself, things like that. An open group, you're going to have people coming in and out. One of the disadvantages of having an open group is that a lot of times the dynamics change. For example, if different people are coming in and out, you're going to have different dynamics because you're going to have different kind of levels of comfort. Whereas in a closed group, if you have the same people that show up, same clients, usually what ends up happening, especially at the working stage, and I'll talk about the stages in a little bit, is that they become comfortable with kind of themselves, and they kind of learn how kind of each client's comfort level is. So it becomes, in my opinion, a little bit more productive, and there's a little bit more flow to the stages. Whereas with the open group, a lot of times you just kind of stay at the initial or transition stage. There's not really a lot of working stage in there. So make sure you know the difference. When you're making groups, make sure you know kind of what you want as far as the group to look like. So if you're, let's say if you're in, I know we have a lot of school staff, if you are working with middle schoolers and you're wanting to work with, okay, let's say you want anger management, and that's just a general common group. Okay, are we looking at female, males? Are we looking at certain grade levels? Are we looking at behavior referrals? What does that group look like? So be very specific. And the reason for that is, one, you want to make a difference, right? Part of your job is to create a positive environment. Two, you want to inform the parents, so you want to create allies with parents. And three, you really want the stated objective to co-align with your mission. So if your school district, if your school is following the ASCA model, one of the requirements is to align your objectives with your classroom guidance, your group work, as well as kind of the school in general. So that's why I talk about kind of the formation stage and kind of knowing what that looks like. Also, if you're working with a co-facilitator, or you have, let's say you're a intern and you have a school counselor, LPC, you have to really talk about what the division of responsibilities are. So a lot of times when I work with another counselor in a group, I would start off maybe talking about the introduction, and then I would talk about kind of the general theme, and then my co-facilitator would talk about more of the specific examples, would try to align. And a lot of times when you have a co-facilitator, and you divide those responsibilities, what I like about that is that one person can be talking and can be kind of listening, and while the other person is kind of looking at the dynamics of the room, and if there's a specific situation, or if there's something that maybe the other facilitator didn't get, then that other person can kind of notice it. So I certainly recommend having a co-facilitator. I think it makes things a lot, well, it can make things run smoother. Modeling, that's used a lot in groups, especially with social skills. If let's say we're working at the elementary level and we're teaching them friendship, for example, that's a common group that a lot of counselors use. Modeling, role-playing, acting, things like that, those are all important, especially at the developmental age. And you know what, even for middle and high school, I think modeling is important at that level as well. And it's not as common, but I really hope that it becomes more common, because a lot of times I'm not sure, as far as kind of the neurology, the brain doesn't stop developing until about 25. So a lot of times we see a middle or high school kid, and we see, like, physically they're adult-like, but developmentally they're still processing things very differently than an adult. So modeling takes things more concretely, make things more of a visual for them. And that's what I like about it. Resistance, let's talk about that for a little bit. So resistance talks about kind of the dynamics of a client who is at a stage of change where they don't, or their cons are greater than their pros. So when we talk about the stages of change, the pre-contemplative, contemplative, then the action one, they're at the pre-contemplative stage. So when we talk about a resistant client, as it relates to groups, we're really talking about clients who a lot of times are forced into a group. Maybe if it's a minor, a lot of times their parents make them join a group, or a lot of times, the courts. I've worked with court-ordered clients, and I've noticed high levels of resistance. So when we talk about that, we're talking about clients who are at the they're basically, we're looking at it as they're not ready for, or they're contemplating but not necessarily ready for a change. And it's important in a group because in a group, you're going to have different levels of resistance. So keep that in mind. And based on the different levels and the stages of change that the client is in, then you're going to have a very different level of participation. I used to run a truancy group, which is for children who had excessive number of absences, and the judge would bring or would court order them to attend the session, and again, high level of resistance. And this goes beyond our course, but just know that there's different techniques to deal with that. And first step is awareness. As a facilitator, you have to be aware. And there's different levels of techniques that you can use in order to kind of address some of the pre-contemplative stages of development. Orientation in a group, I think, is very important, and different counselors do it differently. In more of a agency, hospital, private setting that I've worked in, usually what's common is that the client, before the group gets started, the counselor meets with each client one-on-one, kind of gives them information, explains the skeleton, tells them kind of the purpose, informed consent, all that. In a school, it's a little bit different because a lot of times we don't have the luxury of having an orientation for each student. So usually what I do is that first session, I go over that as a group. So usually I explain that I've spoken with the parents, that this is kind of the skeleton, these are the highlights. I give each student a copy of kind of everything that I explained to the parents so that they're aware. Because again, I want to empower them, I want to empower the parents. Everything that I talk about, I don't want it to be something that is kind of out of left field. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it. The book also talks about reaction theory, and that kind of is related to the resistance. So reaction theory kind of talks about how people's explains people's behavior as it relates to their reaction. So if you say something, let's say we're talking about anger, and we're talking about examples of, somebody insulted you, somebody talked bad about you. There's different levels of reacting, and the resistant client, they're in their seat with their arms crossed, kind of making gestures and all that. That's part of that reaction theory. So they're going through something mentally that is making them react in a certain way. Screening your clients, that's really important, especially if we're talking about groups that are dealing with self-mutilation, things like cutting, drug abuse, things like eating disorders. Really, you want to screen your clients. You want to make sure they're appropriate. If they're at a point where they're too severe or they're showing too many symptoms, they may not be appropriate to put them in a group. If a client is self-mutilating to the point where, it's pretty intense, a lot of times what's recommended is more of an individual therapy rather than a group, and that relates to other conditions as well. So it's not just that's just one example. Okay, we talked about the structure, how you wanted it closed, open, and finally let me talk about the transition stages. So that relates to the 4 stages of a group. The first stage is the initial. So here we're talking about introductions, giving them an outline, talking about main points, answering any questions, noting resistance, noting kind of the levels of changes that each client is in. And as you facilitate groups and as you get better at them, you'll kind of know which clients are at which levels of or which stages of change. So there's going to be some clients that are, your participants, they're ready, they take notes, they're kind of on top of it, and usually those are the clients who are kind of your leaders, so to say. Then you're going to have some clients that are unsure, they're not clear, they're kind of contemplating, is it, are the cons better than the pros? Is it worth changing? Things like that, and those clients are the ones, in my opinion, that you really need to focus on, because you want them to ally with your clients who are kind of prepared for change. And then the other group, those are kind of the resistance. So why am I here? Somebody made me do this. I don't care. And those clients, again, goes beyond this group, but just know that there's techniques for working with them. And a lot of times you want the prepared and the contemplative to kind of push those clients along so that they can see some of the changes, because I think part of what makes groups so powerful is that you identify with others. We're social creatures, but part of why depression is so common is because there's a lot of isolation. So part of the power of group is that we can identify with someone. We can say, oh, this person is going through something very similar to what I am going through, and look what change they're making. So if they can do it, I certainly can do it. So you want to create that alliance. Transition, that's the second stage, that deals with going from that orientation more into the concrete. So now you're kind of dipping your feet in the water, so to speak, but you're still kind of in the shallow end. So in the transition, you see a lot of the resistance, because now we're kind of getting into some stuff that are making people uncomfortable. So when we talk about anger, I have a lot of role play in my groups that I do. We do a lot of situational. If A and then B happens, how do you usually react to C? What are some of the pros and cons of reacting to C? Things like that. So with the transition, you're kind of getting started. You're kind of putting in some of the topics that you want to address. A lot of times with transition, it's a lot of the facilitator talking, and the initial. So the initial transition, a lot of times the facilitator's talking. They're kind of leading it. People are still unsure, resistance, but part of the facilitator's job is to make the environment comfortable. And one thing that I notice that happens, especially with interns, beginners, is that their anxiety is very high, that it kind of shows in the group, and a lot of times with the clients, they can feel that anxiety. So part of working in a group is noticing how you're reacting, and dealing with stress. This job is stressful. This job, being a counselor is a stressful thing. Just last week, I had a really, on my lower back, I had a really red, I had a hit that from a client, and I had, I was basically hurting for about 3 days. So this is by no means an easy job, and I certainly understand that. So moving on to the working stage. The working stage, we're dealing with Now we're putting things in practice. Now we're talking about the vocabulary. We're talking about examples. We're role playing. Clients are learning. Hopefully, they're applying what we're learning to situations. This is kind of the meat, and this is kind of where clients grow the most. So if you provided a good foundation at the initial and the transition, then the working stage, the facilitator is just kind of sitting back and just kind of directing, almost like an orchestra director. You're just kind of pointing to each client, and they're doing the work. So they're providing feedback. They're helping each other. They're giving you examples of what works for them. They're brainstorming. They're doing all this. And when you get to that point and you actually see it happen, I mean, it's a great thing. When I was in my program and I got to experience that, it almost made all that work and everything worth it, because I had the kids basically taking ownership and taking leadership of their behaviors, their objectives, what they wanted to accomplish. Things like that. And finally, the final stage, it's usually a celebration. So I like to really highlight how far they have come from the beginning until now. And I like to be very concrete. In a school group, I noticed your teacher is giving you a lot better behavior chart notes. I've noticed there hasn't been any behavioral referrals. I've noticed, you're able to talk, or you're able to speak more of your emotions. You're able to tell others how you feel instead of reacting, and instead of hurting others, you're able to discuss it in a more meaningful way. So things like that. That's kind of a celebration that I like to highlight. And I like to really bring out the positives, and show them that change is possible, that we can all change, and we can all change for the better. So really that encouraging feedback. And also, I didn't talk about this, but evaluation and follow-up, I think it's important. Again, according to the ASCA model, we should all, or school counselors should be running surveys, parents, student surveys, and I like to just create a little, what did I like, what did I not like. I also give that to the parents, keep them involved, because part of my job is to be data driven. And what that means is, at the end of the year, when I'm doing my evaluation with my administrator, I want to show them, this is what I did, this is my evaluations, this is kind of what impact I created, this is how I'm adding value to the school environment. And it's the same thing at an agency level. You want to create meaningful evaluations. You want to highlight, not only for your administrator, but if you're working at a nonprofit, for example, you want to show really donors or whoever is supporting that agency what type of community impact that you're making. A lot of times we're great at making the impacts, but we're not so great at putting it in concrete ways where other people can see it. So we say we make an impact, and I'm sure you do, but how? How are you making that impact? Show me the data to back up that you're making that impact, so that it can be more powerful. And again, the better you do it, I usually take those surveys, put them into categories, put them in an Excel kind of file and then make graphs and print those graphs. And I like to show parents, this is kind of parent-student feedback, and this is kind of the groups that we're running, and also administrators. Because again, I think a lot of times we make the mistakes of just saying, oh, we make an impact without really being concrete and data-driven. So that goes with evaluation and follow-up. Follow-up really deals with anything that any client maybe feels like they need help with. A lot of times, like with anger management or social skills, things like that, I always like to follow up with students and just see kind of how they're doing. So after the group ends, maybe 2-3 weeks, if I see a student, I like to bring them in and just say, hey, how are things going now? What do you think you can still use some help with? And usually, if they tell me, hey, I think I still need some work, then we can talk about, either community resources or maybe joining another group that they can continue to work on, because again, it's a continuum. It's not just, I have my magic wand and you're fixed. This is more of a skills, and like any skills, there's going to be regression, there's going to be resistance, but as long as we're working, as long as we're processing it, I think positive impact will occur. Okay, so we talked about feedback and data-driven things. We talked about the final stage, self-disclosure. I want to highlight. In group, I always state I cannot guarantee confidentiality, and that's very important. Again, LPC Ask a Model states that we have to disclose that, and we cannot. So I always tell adults, children, whatever you don't feel comfortable sharing, please don't. If you would rather tell me at an individual level, please do so, because I can't control another client going around and telling everybody else what's been shared in the group. So that's a difference between individual session and a group session. So that I wanted to highlight that. We talked about group cohesion and kind of how that plays a role. Termination, again, make sure that things go through the working stages, and that everything is in there's really no, how do I say this, there's no things that have been left in the air without necessarily being discussed. And this is important, especially as a beginning counselor. A lot of times when I was first starting, I didn't notice things that I notice now, as it relates to nonverbals. Going back to theories that just SALT, a lot of times a beginning counselor, they're so focused on themselves and that anxiety that they don't see a lot of what's going on. So that's one thing that I would share as a professor now, because that's something that I struggled with, myself. So be sure to keep that in mind. And finally, let me just make sure I covered everything as far as kind of the group process, the evolution of a group, kind of the different dynamics. I think that those are the main highlights that I want to cover this week. I will end with one of my favorite Martin Luther King quotes, which states, like an unchecked cancer, hate corrodes the personality and eats away its vital unity. Hate destroys a man's sense of values and his objectivity. It causes him to describe the beauty as ugly and the ugly as beauty, and to confuse the true with the false and the false with the true. One thing I love about my profession and counselors and the helping profession in general, social workers, psychologists, counselors, is that we promote, I would say we promote the well-being, and part of the well-being is the love. Love your neighbor, love others, love yourself. So I wanted to end with that. Again, this is week 2. Please read the announcements, please read the syllabus, and that concludes the video for this week. Thank you very much.